You think you're making your own decisions. What to do, when to start, what to focus on. But most of the time, you're not choosing anything. You're reacting to your phone, to your room, to what's in front of you, to what's easy to access. And the dangerous part is, it doesn't feel like control is missing. It feels normal. Because your environment doesn't force you. It guides you. Silently. So you wake up, check your phone without thinking, delay what matters, and move toward what's easier. Not because you decided to, but because it was there. So let me ask you something, and answer this honestly in the comments. If your environment stayed exactly the same for the next year, would your life actually change? Because if the answer is no, then you're not the one deciding your life. Your environment is. Your environment is not neutral. It's shaping you all the time. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way you easily notice, but through repetition. What you see every day. What's within reach? What requires less effort? All of that creates direction, because your brain is constantly looking for efficiency. It doesn't ask, what's the best thing I could do right now? It asks, what's the easiest thing available? And your environment answers that question instantly. If your phone is next to you, attention goes there. If distractions are visible, your focus follows them. If what matters requires effort to access, your brain delays it. Not because you're lazy, but because your system is responding exactly the way it was designed to. This is why willpower feels unreliable, because you're trying to fight something that is constantly influencing you. You're trying to choose against your environment over and over again, and eventually you lose. Not because you're weak, but because your surroundings are making the decision easier in the opposite direction. So the real question is not, why can't I stay consistent? It's, what is my environment making easier for me right now? You don't repeat your life by accident. You repeat it by design. Not a design you consciously chose, but one you're living inside of. Because your environment creates patterns, and patterns create behavior. Think about your day. You wake up in the same place, see the same objects, follow the same paths, interact with the same triggers. And without realizing, you respond the same way. Not because you decided to, but because nothing changed around you. So your brain doesn't need to think. It recognizes, it predicts, it repeats. That's how habits are formed, not through motivation, but through exposure. The more you see something, the more automatic your response becomes. And over time, that becomes your normal. Not because it's right, not because it's intentional, but because it's familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It feels safe, it feels easy, it feels natural. Even when it's holding you back, that's why you can want change and still live the same way, because desire alone doesn't override environment. Your environment wins, quietly, consistently, every single day. Trying to change your life without changing your environment is like trying to swim against a current that never stops. You can do it, for a while. You can force focus, you can resist distractions, you can push yourself to act differently. But it costs you, every time, because you're fighting what's around you, instead of being supported by it. And the more you rely on effort alone, the faster you burn out. That's why motivation fades. That's why discipline feels inconsistent. That's why you keep going back to old patterns even when you don't want to. Not because your mind is weak, but because your environment is stronger than your intention. This is what most people don't understand. Your brain is always taking shortcuts. If something is easier to access, it wins. If something requires less effort, it gets chosen. Not because it's better, but because it's available. So when you say, I just need to be more disciplined, what you're really saying is, I will try to fight my environment every day. And that's not sustainable, not long-term, not consistently, because eventually, your brain returns to what's easier. And what's easier is whatever your environment is offering you. You don't need more discipline. You need better defaults. Because the strongest behaviors in your life are not the ones you force. They're the ones that happen automatically, the ones that don't require a decision, the ones that don't depend on how you feel. And those behaviors are not created in your mind. They're created in your environment. Think about it. If something is already set up, you don't hesitate. If it's visible, you're reminded. If it's easy to access, you start without thinking. That's what a good environment does. It removes friction, not from the goal, but from the beginning. Because starting is where most people fail. Not because they can't do the work, but because the work is not immediately accessible, so your brain delays. But when the first step is obvious, simple, and already in front of you, you move. Without overthinking, without negotiation. That's the shift. You stop trying to control your behavior directly and start controlling what triggers your behavior. Because once the trigger is right, the action follows. At some point, this stops being about behavior and becomes about identity. Because you don't become someone through intention. You become someone through repetition, and repetition is shaped by environment. If your environment constantly leads you to distraction, you don't just get distracted. You become someone who is easily distracted. If your environment makes it hard to start what matters, you don't just delay. You become someone who procrastinates, not because that's who you decided to be, but because that's what your system reinforces every day. And over time, that becomes your self-image. I'm not focused. I'm not consistent. I'm not disciplined. But those labels are not personality traits. They're patterns created by what surrounds you. So when you try to change your identity without changing your environment, you create conflict. Because your actions keep proving the opposite of what you're trying to believe. And that's exhausting. You're trying to think like one person while living like another. But when your environment changes, your behavior changes. And when your behavior changes, your identity follows. Not because you forced it, but because you repeated something new long enough for it to become natural. Big decisions feel powerful. I'm going to change. From now on, everything is different. This time, I'll do it right. But those moments don't last, not because you're not serious, but because they depend on intensity. And intensity fades. What actually shapes your life are small adjustments you repeat without thinking, not dramatic changes, invisible ones, where things are placed, what's within reach, what requires effort, and what doesn't. Because your brain doesn't follow intentions. It follows pathways, and pathways are created by what is easiest to do, not what is most important. That's why a small shift in your environment can change more than a big decision ever will. Move something closer, you do it more. Hide something, you do it less. Remove one step, you start faster. Add one obstacle, you delay. Simple, but powerful. Because now, behavior is not something you force. It's something that flows. And over time, those small, almost invisible adjustments start to redefine your entire routine. Not through effort, but through design. If you want to change your behavior, stop asking, "What should I do?" Start asking, "What is my environment making easier right now?" Because that answer explains everything. Most people try to add better habits without removing what's competing with them. So they create conflict. They want to focus, but their environment is built for distraction. They want to be consistent, but everything around them encourages delay. And then they blame themselves. But the problem isn't effort, it's friction. So instead of trying to be stronger, you change the setup. You make the right action easier and the wrong one harder. Not through willpower, through positioning. If something matters, it needs to be visible. If something distracts, it needs to be less accessible. Because your brain will always move toward what requires less resistance. That's not a flaw, that's how it works. And once you accept that, you stop fighting yourself and start designing your life in a way that supports you. One change in your environment doesn't stay isolated. It spreads because your behavior is connected. not in obvious ways, but through patterns your brain tries to keep consistent. If one action becomes easier, others start to align with it. If one distraction disappears, your focus improves in other areas too. That's how change actually happens, not through forcing everything at once, but by shifting one point that influences the rest. Think about it. If your mornings change, your day changes. If your workspace changes, your output changes. If your inputs change, your thoughts begin to shift. Because your environment is not just physical, it's informational. What you see, what you hear, what you consume. All of that feeds your mind, and your mind shapes your actions. So when you adjust one element, you're not just changing behavior, you're changing direction, and direction compounds. Over time, small shifts become noticeable. Noticeable shifts become results, and results reinforce the new pattern. That's the domino effect, not loud, not instant, but consistent. When your environment starts working for you, your mind changes in a way that feels almost quiet. At first, you don't notice anything dramatic. You're not suddenly more motivated. You're not suddenly more disciplined. But things feel easier. You start without overthinking. You continue without forcing. You finish without negotiating. And that removes something that drains most people every day. Internal resistance. That constant tension between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Because before, every action required effort. You had to convince yourself, push yourself, argue with yourself. Now, you don't. You just move. And that creates a different kind of confidence, not emotional, not intense, stable, because it's not based on how you feel, it's based on how your system works. You trust that when the moment comes, you'll act, not because you're stronger, but because the path is already clear. And over time, that removes something even deeper. Doubt, not about the task, about yourself. When your environment starts working for you, your mind changes in a way that feels almost quiet. At first, you don't notice anything dramatic. You're not suddenly more motivated. You're not suddenly more disciplined. But things feel easier. You start without overthinking. You continue without forcing. You finish without negotiating. And that removes something that drains most people every day. Internal resistance. That constant tension between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Because before, every action required effort. You had to convince yourself, push yourself, argue with yourself. Now, you don't. You just move. And that creates a different kind of confidence. Not emotional, not intense, stable. Because it's not based on how you feel. It's based on how your system works. You trust that when the moment comes, you'll act. Not because you're stronger, but because the path is already clear. And over time, that removes something even deeper. Doubt. Not about the task, about yourself. In the end, this was never about discipline. It was about design. Because you don't rise to the level of your intentions, you fall to the level of your environment. If your surroundings are built for distraction, you will be distracted. If everything important requires effort to start, you will delay. Not because you chose that, but because your system led you there. And that's the part most people ignore. They try to change themselves without changing what's shaping them. So they keep fighting every day, every action, every decision. And eventually, they lose. Not because they're weak, but because they're outmatched. So stop trying to control everything from the inside. Start controlling what's around you. Because the moment your environment changes, your behavior follows. And when your behavior changes, your identity starts to shift, not through effort, through repetition. So here's the shift. Don't ask yourself, how do I become more disciplined? Ask, what is my environment making easy right now? Because the moment you change that, you change the direction of your life. If this made something click for you, leave a comment. I design my environment. Because when your environment starts working for you, everything else becomes easier.